Everyone, Patrick here, back at it with a new interview for you, this time with Ruby Smith Diaz, who is an Afro-Latina multidisciplinary artist, educator, and body positive personal trainer. We're here specifically to talk about her new book, which came out this year through Arsenal Pulp Press, called Searching for Serafim, The Life and Legacy of Serafim Joe Fortes, who, for those of you who don't know, was the first lifeguard in Vancouver and has become a kind of Afro-Latino cultural icon. And so we talk a little bit about her methodology, researching this historical figure, and get into all kinds of really interesting discussions about Afro-Latina history in the early 20th and late 19th centuries. So I hope you enjoy it, and I highly recommend that people check out Searching for Seraphim. As usual, there is a link in the description. It's very good.
Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation.
Wonderful. So I'm here with Ruby Smith Diaz, and we're going to be talking about her latest book, Searching for Seraphim. So I guess the best question to start off with, or at least the broadest question, would you mind explaining to the audience what exactly this book is? For those of us who might not have heard of it, well, I've read it, but for those of our listeners who might not have heard of it or who might not be aware of it.
Yeah, this book is about a layered exploration of Vancouver's first lifeguard, Serafim Joe Fortes, or Fortes. And it's done through the eyes of myself, an Afro-Latina person, seeking to uncover deeper layers about this Black man's story that lived at the turn of the last century. And in this way, it is really different than a traditional history book or a biography, and also speaks to a lot of the tensions and experience that racialized individuals, specifically Afro-Latinos living in Canada, have experienced, that I have experienced.
Wonderful. And there's a few things in that answer that I already want to pick up on. And the fact that you mentioned it's not quite a history, it's not quite a biography, and you do certainly get a sense of that in the writing of the book itself, right? It's not written in an academic formal style necessarily that you would expect from a history book, and yet it still tries to fill in the gaps of Seraphim's life, right? Mm-hmm. So I guess my question would be, what led to this decision as far as writing is concerned, or why did you decide to approach it as neither a history or biography, and how might you qualify it if it's neither or?
Yeah. I didn't intend to write a book, I'll be completely honest. A lot of this was actually inspired through my residency at the Contemporary Art Gallery of Vancouver, which we were tasked to do an audio exploration or an audio output around a figure or a place in Vancouver from the last 100 years. And in that audio exploration, I ended up writing soliloquy for Serafim, which is the last portion of my book, which came out more for me as a poetic exploration. And in the audio version of it also incorporates a lot of place-based sounds that I feel was critical to Seraphim's story. In that mentorship and residency opportunity, I had to work with Wade Compton, who is one of the most renowned writers on Black history in British Columbia. And he just encouraged me to keep writing. And, I thought to myself, well, I'm not sure if there's really much to write about here. Yeah. Like, I feel like I've covered it in this audio exploration. And I just started writing a little bit more context around the piece. And before I knew it, I ended up with this book, essentially, around Seraphim's life. And as I was writing it, I found that I was having such visceral reactions to the information that I was reading as I continued doing deeper dives into newspaper articles that were written about Seraphim's life. And I wanted to also understand more of the context, because it wasn't just it didn't suffice to just read these articles about this person's life. I wanted to understand everything that was going on around him that maybe created the context where he might have felt somewhat safe in some ways within a very white supremacist society, openly white supremacist society at the turn of the century. but also I wanted to understand what was happening around the land and what was happening in Vancouver's history. And that's the portion that for me is always missing when we talk about Canadian history in the mainstream, where we forget about that we're living on stolen land. And I say we, settler people and Indigenous people, are living on stolen land, and the displacement that has happened and continues to happen has very real impacts and effects to what we see today and the experiences that we have on these territories.
Absolutely. And those are all points that I have questions about later, because I think it's really important to highlight this. The stolen land part is something that I think you're correct in saying settlers broadly have an impact on, right? And this is something that you raise in relation to Serafim that might complicate his history a little bit, right? As far as where he positions himself vis-a-vis this idea. So we can kind of pick up on that a little bit later, but I had some other preliminary questions beforehand, and one of them was about your own background and experiences, which you just brought up in that answer. And it makes the book feel a lot more personal in many ways. Obviously, well, I say obviously, I felt deliberately so, right, in the writing. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on how the thinking through your own background and own experiences with similar things as Serafim is living actually influenced your interpretation and construction of his life. Like, can you give us tangible examples on how that impacted the construction of the book?
Absolutely. I think the biggest connection that I felt when reading about his story was, I guess, the absence of context about his cultural identity that for me shapes everything in terms of how I see the world. Growing up, I grew up in Treaty 6 territory in Amiskwaci, also colonially known as Edmonton. I felt that there were so many portions of my life that I didn't see represented in society growing up. So many things that I didn't realize were more unique to me until I grew up and until I was, I guess, living outside of Edmonton as well. But I think one of the biggest things that I think about, it sounds really basic, but is something as simple as food, and my
Yeah.
experience living in Edmonton, living in Vancouver has always been around what's put at the dinner table and how we can also connect what's put at the dinner table with pieces that we bring of ourselves from the diaspora, whether it be the African diaspora or the Latin American diaspora. But I find that that has always been a hunt for these items in these cities that predominantly cater to, European diets
Yeah.
that I didn't find in abundance. And so something as simple as like, where are we going to find, torta de mil hojas, like 1,000 layer cake that's like dulce de leche or manjar, and that was like something that I grew up with, like always missing it and like going over to the other end of town to go get it from this one bakery that existed, or something as simple as like, where am I going to get sorrel from? I
Yeah.
just moved to Ladysmith's to Manus Territories this last year, and it's been a complete reorientation of, okay, where can I find a shop that reminds me of the things that I grew up with at home? And so something as simple as where do I find these items that I grew up with led me also to kind of imagine what are some other aspects that he might have missed, in his diet, but also that would have reminded him of home. And I think one of the more powerful examples that I found as well was when I took a visit to the Vancouver archives and was able to see some samples of Seraphim's writing. And there's some samples that are written partially in Spanish and partially in English. And they're not complete sentences and they don't quite make sense. And it reminded me so much of what my writing was like when I was 5, 6, 7 years old. And I was put in an English language learners class because at that time, most of my upbringing was in Chilean or Colombian households,
Right.
Colombian households when I was working during the day. And so that meant that my language was also kind of like straddling to different continents a lot of the time. And it reminded me too of like the silibarios that I had to do, kind of like the workbooks, to try to get my Spanish up to snuff, but also having to face the same struggle in school to get my English up to snuff as well. And sometimes just being caught in the middle of both and not being sufficient in either.
Yeah.
And that also really drew me into his story of like, maybe that's also where you kind of remained in between these two different languages and also cultural identity.
Yeah. This is really interesting because you mentioned Wade Compton talking to you and all that, and I feel you also see this in a lot of his work as well. These kinds of dualities that you're bringing up. But yeah, this is not an episode on Wade, but yeah, I'm just trying to make connections, obviously here. But I appreciate that one, and it gets at the heart of a method, I guess, the methodology of this book, if you want to call it that, which you refer to as speculative archiving a few moments in the text. And yeah, just the example that you gave of Serafim's writing itself having gaps, right? It is technically an archive, but as a reader in the 21st century, we're left to fill in what might have been missing or what might have been intended or what might have been relevant for the time when that act of writing was taking place, which is where the speculative part comes in. I don't know if you wanted to elaborate on that, but that's kind of how I understood it. And I'm curious if you can elaborate for the listeners on the challenges that you faced in navigating these gaps, right? Because again, it goes against the very notion of history writing is to engage with the gaps themselves, right? So I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to add about what that might imply as a methodology or what might be challenging about that as a methodology and why it might be so important for the work that you're doing here, right? Or that you did here, I should say.
I mean, it's both beautiful and heartbreaking for me to
Yeah.
lean into speculative archiving. I mean, the heartbreak there for me is the fact that so many of my ancestors are not known to me, and the ones that are known and documented a lot of the times are documented because somebody decided to put them down, the names of individuals, as insurance documents.
Yeah.
In terms of like, okay, I need to count how many people or how much property that I have and be able to get insured if anything were to happen to said quote unquote property.
Mm-hmm.
There's something deeply heartbreaking in that, like, I can't a lot of the time access that information. And if I were, it has to be through insurance documents as if people, human beings, were objects.
Yeah.
There's
Quite
something
literally an insurance number.
yeah, and there's something incredibly heartbreaking as well in terms of, that the other portion of the archives can be found, through police records. And Naya Lewis in Vancouver also did an incredible exhibit around this, but just how much of our history is in police records because of how our very existence and our very search for freedom has been criminalized since the get-go, right? And I find that a lot of my work also just needs to process that grief. And we can't just say, oh, okay, it was a difficult search for the archives, as if nothing happened to create the circumstances that made those searches difficult.
Right.
I find it heartbreaking that like I can't actually go back that many layers of my own history. Like I know that on my dad's side of my family, like folks were kidnapped and brought to Jamaica, but beyond like the generation of my great grandmother, I don't have records,
Right.
and that's really tragic to me. And in that tragedy, I always think about, the fact that they are still with us. My ancestors are still with me. Our ancestors in the larger African diaspora are still with us, even if we're not able to connect with them directly. And I think there's a lot of opportunity here to imagine what their lives might have been like, what the desires that they had might have been. And I strongly believe that there's some element of them that lives through me in my flesh. And it's obviously impossible to know, but it's how DNA works, right? Like we have to get passed on from one person to the next and the next generation and so on. And so in that part, like there is part of them that is alive in me. And that gives me also the opportunity to kind of like open a portal in a way and be able to understand and dream what their story might have been.
Yeah, I really like that use of the term portal here. Because on some level there is some something, well, there's the speculative, yes, imagination, but speculative in the sci-fi sense almost. And I like that use of portal here. That kind of gets at that, at least in my imagination. But yeah, it's fantastic. I think even if you don't mention speculative archives directly in the text, I think it does infuse a lot of the way that you construct Seraphim's story in a really fascinating way that I encourage listeners who do pick up the book to look out for, because I think it infuses the text with a layer that you don't often see in a lot of contemporary books, or that you start to see perhaps in more decolonial minded books, which we can get to perhaps a little bit later. But those were the questions that I had about the I guess things surrounding the book, right? The methodology and so on. But of course, this is a book about Seraphim, and I was wondering if you could just give listeners a little bit of an indication about how Serafim got to where he was in Vancouver as the first lifeguard, which is an odd place to be in history, right? In the history books, it's not something that you would expect a book to be written about, and yet it's so fascinating as a history. So I don't know if there's a way of saying that in a very concise answer, right? But can you give listeners a little bit of context as to, Seraphim's history and how he got to where he is best known for in the history books?
As far as we know, Trinidad is the Seraphim homeland and birthplace. And from Trinidad, Seraphim leaves as a teen. He's very young. He's 18, 19. In what seems to be kind of like a decision to look for something larger than to perhaps work on a plantation during the labor possibilities of Trinidad at that time, and decides to take his chances and board a ship and goes over to Liverpool. He spends a lot of time actually traveling throughout the different continents, working on a ship, doing everything from, keeping the ship clean, making food, shining boots, all of those kinds of tasks, and kind of winds up on the West Coast in Vancouver by accident. The ship that he's on ends up striking something just off of the coast and can't be salvaged. And at this point in time, he's 19 years old when he arrives in Vancouver, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories, and he never returns home. Now, Vancouver at this time, of course, is going through a series of massive changes in terms of displacement, in terms of the destruction of the land and building up essentially like a colony. And within that, his ability to be able to swim and also to swim proficiently enough to support other people in the water becomes taken note of, because at this time going to the ocean, going to the water wasn't very much a thing that people in Canada, and by people I mean specifically settler populations, didn't enjoy in on a very they didn't enjoy in very frequently. And so what Seraphim is able to offer is a skill that nobody else has, which is being able to provide his lifeguarding services to a population that is looking to escape all of the smog, all of the pollution from the mass amount of clearing that is happening on Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories, spend time by the water, and to be able to find some reprieve from that heavy atmosphere. And that's kind of where his story takes off.
Right, absolutely. And this is a question I had a little bit later, but since you raised it specifically as something actively going on in the late 19th and early 20th century in British Columbia, which is the displacement of local Indigenous populations. You refer to it in the book as the displacement of Squamish nations at gunpoint to give up their ancestral village, sites, and their homes, which is as concise a way of explaining it as possible. And I'm wondering, to what extent do you think Seraphim, who did live near these displacements, right, was aware of them and understood the full implications of this ongoing displacement and genocide, and as you mentioned, even ecocide, if we want to use that term, right? This is where the speculative part enters into the game perhaps a little bit more, but I'm wondering to what extent do you think he was aware of this going on?
I mean, when I first started writing about him, one of the first things that I did is I went down to English Bay Beach, which I learned the original name for English Bay is a Yelshin, which is a Squamish village site. And I just sat and spent time there where he would have been to get a sense of what the land looked like. What was he looking at across the water where he spent 30 years of his life? What was to the left of him, to the right of him, all of that. And I wanted to take that in to be able to understand maybe things that he would have seen or experienced when he was alive. And across the water, right at that point, is Sinnoch, or where the Vancouver Archives, funny enough, is located. We also, I think, have like the Vancouver Museum, Planetarium. There's this huge tract of land that a lot of major Vancouver institutions is located. But Sinnoch was a village site, and exactly like you described, that Squamish residents were, or Squamish people were displaced from at gunpoint. And as I was looking into that history, I was looking also at the dates of when this happened, which would have been 1911. And I could not understand how nobody else wasn't writing about maybe what he was seeing, especially since he had to be stationed at Yelshin, at English Bay, for the 30 years. It was expected of him to be there day and night, year round. And so if you're spending that much time on the water and there's a village site directly across from you, that had many longhouses, that had many canoes and people that were like harvesting berries, that were also going fishing, going back and forth, that displacement would have been witnessed. I don't understand how it wouldn't have been, because people had their homes and structures there. It wasn't as if, people were just there visiting and didn't have homes, and you could just say, oh, I just thought that people were just kind of walking through or whatnot.
Yeah.
People had their homes there. And so I do think that that's something that he would have witnessed in the time that he was lifeguarding and set up his home on English Bay Beach as well. And I also think that he most likely would have also interacted with Squamish people at some point in time while he was lifeguarding and while he was kind of like joining the array of squatters that were also setting up their homes on English Bay Beach at that time, because we also know that Yelshin was also a site where people would gather a lot of traditional medicines and berries. And so because this displacement is happening so actively at this time, I still think that there would have been many Squamish people that would have visited or would have gone to their sites like they had always done and tried to collect their medicines and carry on with ceremony or activities as they had, even maybe if there weren't so numerous. But I do feel that he would have likely interacted with somebody or many people from the Squamish.
Yeah, and I do agree with I find your question engaging of, I don't understand why no one would have written about this, right? Because it would have been an ongoing event at that moment. And the only reason that I can come up with is that it had become so normalized by then, right? Colonization in Canada generally took place from east to west, right? Mostly. There was obviously some west to east going on, but it happened a little bit later, perhaps, in the history. And it's by then would have been at least expected, quote unquote, like huge air quotes in this case, as far as settler interactions with Indigenous people. And that's the only thing that I can come up with as far as an answer to that question, right? Of why nobody would have written by that about that is because it would have been normal, unfortunately so, right?
I mean,
Criminally so.
In some ways, like maybe
Yeah.
normalized, but again, if we're talking about like, his direct experience
Sure.
and again, a man who spends so much time on the beach and like, I know a lot of the displacement, and again, talking about displacement in an active sense, that continues to happen, but at this particular point in time kind of happened away from view of
Yeah.
settlers in many cases, in terms of like, the Indian Act, the creation of reserve systems, and a lot of like structures being away from where settlers were, like intentionally so. But this was happening right in front of,
Yeah.
or would be happening right in front of his eyes, right? In terms of like those houses, those longhouses still would have been there.
Yeah.
People still would have been on site, right? If people got
Yeah.
loaded onto the barge in 1911, that is an act of displacement that you witness, like right on the water. So there's a lot to me that I also just push back on, because it is an intentional forgetting of these histories, and also forgetting as well of like the relationships of settler colonialism that Black folks have been intertwined with, in many cases without our consent, in these displacement processes. And so I think it's an important thing to talk about, because otherwise we're missing his story. We're missing the story of these lands and where we're living.
Yeah, and that brings up another like passage from the book that I thought was particularly interesting, where you note that a young Serafim, quoting from you here, claimed to have proudly discovered, quote unquote, Yelchin one day while paddling along the inlet shore, making no mention of the Squamish Nation or the cultural significance of that land. And that ties in, I guess, to what you're saying here, and I'm wondering if there is a way to reconcile this kind of duality of him or black citizens and black bodies in Canada as simultaneously marginalized and participating in settler colonialism. Yeah, I don't know if there is a way to like. I guess it is a messy reconciliation, right? That has to happen in some way, and I emphasize messy here. But I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to add on that. But I thought that like passage from your book was particularly appropriate to what we're saying here.
Yeah, I mean, it's so layered and it's so complex. I think the processes of settler colonialism, unfortunately, has also pitted Indigenous and Black communities against each other in
Yep.
many ways. And there have been many examples in which, like, people of African descent, Black people, have kind of resisted being parts of that, and have gone and like allied
Yep.
with Indigenous nations, like we see in the southern portion of the United States, where instead of like being pitted against each other, people unify and form forces and become like the biggest threat to the United States Army. But we also see this, you know, in Mi'kmaq, in eastern Canada, Nova Scotia, where communities come together. In Mi'kmaq communities also kind of like open their doors, provide shelters to recently displaced, recently arrived, and refugees that are of African descent. And at the same time, we see, you know, in British Columbia, James Douglas, who again is part Black himself, who extends this invitation specifically to Black residents of California to come up and to have land, right? Of land where they can farm on, where they can have their freedom on, which again, to put yourself into the mind and the body of somebody who has been enslaved themselves for the entire lives, who's had their family enslaved for the entire lives, who has that for many generations past in their history and their own lineage. You see this opportunity and you think, okay, this is my ticket out. This is my ticket out from being sexually abused every single day, from being whipped every single day, from my lifespan on average ending at age 25. This is my ticket to freedom. And I have so much reverence and respect and like understanding for like, okay, we are getting out. We don't know where we're going, but it is a way out. And funny enough, now with this whole ridiculous idea of Canada so-called being desired as the 51st state of the United States, and specifically where I'm living right now in Ladysmith, which is around the 49th parallel, I've been really thinking about this as well in terms of, yes, like specifically the Black settlers that were invited by James Douglas coming up here, forming militias as well to prevent United States citizens and armies from taking more land from so-called Canada, aka also more stolen land from Sayout nations, I think specifically in Wasanich. And so we have this moment where I at first didn't understand their desire to defend their territory, this newfound territory, and I actually found it quite repulsive in terms of, well, there's Indigenous people that are still trying to access their territory and their homes, that have had their homes stolen. And there's a lot of aggression also from Black communities as well towards Indigenous communities that is documented, especially around Salt Spring Island. And I thought to myself, well, why would you do that? We're the thing here in the struggle against colonialism. But then I also started thinking about like the context and going back again to this moment that we're living in right now, where I don't consider myself somebody who's very patriotic, but I do fear what might happen if we have an incredibly fascist president start leading these northern territories, and what that could mean for people like myself. And that's what has also brought me to kind of like a new level of understanding of like they weren't necessarily patriotic about Canada or about their lands, but they might have also been thinking about, well, if we get bought out by the United States and if they establish a foothold up here, it is back to being whipped every day. It is back to being separated from our families, to our lives getting cut short. It is back to that, and we have to stop it from happening.
Yeah.
And that to me has provided a lot more compassion in understanding too for some of the ways in which these militias and these Black only militias were formed along the West Coast as well. Not saying that it is a just history or that their actions are always justified, but it does give me a little bit more context perhaps into what they were dreaming and what they were trying to escape from.
Absolutely. I think that's a very important historical parallel to highlight. That was one of my questions later, is like, how can we fit this in with contemporary times? And I think that's a really, really insightful way of doing so. Thank you for that. I guess another way of approaching this is by bringing this specifically back to Serafim's life, and his life as a lifeguard, right? And this was not a position that was officially recognized or even paid, you mentioned in the book, until 1901, when actually thousands of Vancouverites petitioned on his behalf. And I think this is a moment that does demonstrate these perhaps slippery or uncertain racial dynamics and political dynamics that are at play in the West Coast at the time, as you mentioned, white supremacist part of the country, or part of a white supremacist country, and at the same time demanding at least some level of recognition for an othered, quote unquote, man like Serafim would have been, right? And I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on that, or say a little bit about how this either the resistance to paying him reveals something about the racial hierarchies of Vancouver, or how the petition to have him paid also reveals something about those moments.
Yeah, I mean, I think by nature, if you save over 100 lives in a period of 20, 30 years, it is going to turn some heads. And I think it is going to politicize some people in ways that maybe they wouldn't have been interested in participating in. Because it would have impacted them directly, right? To see potentially like their own daughters, sons, almost pass away and get rescued by this man. And then and probably also because Vancouver, while it is growing, it is quite still quite small at this time. And seeing maybe stories and hearing stories of friends and family that also experience the same thing. I think you're going to have a lot of respect and a lot of love for the person that saved the life of somebody who you care for. And I think that is a big factor in terms of just like us as human beings feeling that connection. I think also within that, there are still ways in which white settler society still has to be able to justify their love for a Black man within the white supremacist context that they're living in. And I give a lot of examples of this during the book, but whenever Serafim is spoken about, there is always some way, almost always some way in which he is excused for being Black, whether it is pointing out, oh, but he's not as dark as those other Negroes, or whether it's, despite him being Black, he's still able to X, Y, and Z. Or, despite him being Black, he is still upholding a lot of the Christian values that we have, more so than anybody else. He has the soul of a white person, I think one person actually says, as his final respects. So I think there's all these like kinds of mental gymnastics that people also have to do to be able to recognize him for his labor. And within that, finding kind of like that space of comfort to be able to say like, yes, because he is unlike the other Negroes, we can support him and petition for his pay. Or alternatively, because he saved the life of my son or my daughter, I want that man to be paid for his services and to live a good life, or maybe both.
Right, absolutely. And to add even onto that, there are moments where, of course, you mentioned things like segregation, where Serafim as a Black person or Black people in general would not necessarily have had access to the same public spaces or to public spaces in the same way as white people would have had access to those public spaces, or the quote unquote forgetting of attack by a cotton hook, which is symbolically loaded, to say the least, as an attack. Do you feel like there was a bit of shift in the way that people addressed Serafim, right, from the time that he was living and engaging with Vancouverites to after his death, as there was kind of a myth of him being a universally beloved figure going on, right? Do you feel like that happened to him specifically, or is that perhaps me overreading in this speculative imaginary that we're?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. Attitudes towards Seraphim himself probably shifted
Mhm.
um, as people established more proximity with him. I don't want to say relationships because
Yeah.
it really does not appear that he formed relationships with many white folks in the sense of like, inviting him over for tea, inviting him over for dinner, anything like that. That is at least documented in the archives or in the newspapers. And also I want to say that relationship with him as being exceptional because we know that this is not the experience that Jack Johnson has, one of the
Yeah.
world's greatest boxers at this time. And I describe this in my book where, yes, he's met by the media, Vancouver media in the morning, and by night, he is turned away from 3, 4, 5 hotels before having to stay with a boxing coach from Vancouver who's also Black and has to sleep on the couch of this man's house. And that to me is a prime example of, okay, somebody also who, has, personality, has been recognized for his athleticism, for his feats, who gets the same level of media attention, is still not treated in the same way as Seraphim is. And again, many possible reasons for that. But I think this definitely highlights that it was him in particular, the way that he carried himself, the way that he formed different relationships from kind of afar, but in terms of people being familiar with who he was, I think that helped shift some of the stereotypes that
Mhm.
people would have probably held about who he was. But they again show up, in almost all of his obituaries that are written about him in 1902, where again, it's constantly having to apologize for him being a Black man, and constantly talking about, in spite of all of these shortcomings, he was still a wonderful man. Shortcomings simply because he.
Sure. Yeah. And one of the things that you raise in the book, sorry, I was looking at the question just to make sure that where I was going with this. One of the things that you raise in the book is that he wasn't only a lifeguard, right? He eventually became a special constable, right? And as people are at least, I'm sure, aware of, this is historically, right, the police a force of oppression, especially towards non-white peoples. And how do you feel like Seraphim balanced this position as a literal embodiment of oppression, and being a Black man in a white supremacist cities? Do you feel like he did try to balance this? This is, I guess, an extension of the Indigenous question that we asked earlier, but I still think it's an important one to raise.
I mean, I think in one sense, if we look at him through the eyes of perhaps him being, not perhaps, but through the eyes of him as a 19-year-old that has just arrived to these territories and that has left home perhaps in maybe an incomplete way, in the sense that there seems to have been some sort of quarrel or separation between him and his parents, and that maybe like wounded child desire to like make something of himself. I think in many ways for him, this was a role that he was proud of like, hey, I get to show off my abilities, my talents. He had a brother who was a doctor. Now he is a police officer. He's got a shiny new badge, or a special constable, a little bit different, but he's got a shiny new badge. He's made himself somewhere overseas, and this is who I am, and I'm proud now. I can understand that in the sense of like a wounded child. and through the eyes of that. But I also find it very difficult to understand his motivations to also abuse his powers within that. And there's a couple documented cases where specifically he assaults and also suspects Chinese people of a theft or being about to commit an act of robbery or theft. And none of these are ever proven in court. Like he's taken to court over these, and lawyers show up and point out that there was actually no evidence. And in one case, in the case where he stops this Chinese man from being able to enter the premises of this home that he was actually providing services to, I think, to do laundry, I think, more specifically, it's shown that he never actually even let that man get onto the property because of his own prejudices that he held of Chinese people and them being criminals. This is something that I really struggle with understanding, again, in the sense of, in my view, when we're talking about a white supremacist context, people who are impacted by white supremacy, non-whites, we're in the same boat. You know, we're in the same boat in terms of how these policies shorten our lifespan, how these policies impact our everyday interaction, what we're able to accomplish in terms of what professions we're able to get to, all of these things. And I don't understand how we can just kind of ignore that and attack other racial groups as well. But I also understand that we're human. And in that sense, none of us are perfect. None of us, make sound decisions 100% of the time. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. As much as he was a hero, he was also very much human with his mistakes.
Yeah.
I really push back on this role of him protecting I guess, like English Bay beach goers, which again, by everything that seems to be in and around the archives, seems to have been only white folks that were permitted there. And I do speculate because of the histories that come within the next decade, the next 2 decades, in terms of Brown Skin Beach, which Joyce Barry speaks to, which was kind of in the same area, but a decade later. But Brown Skin Beach, because it was the only beach area that it seems that non-white folks could hang out in and be in Vancouver. We also have the policies of Crystal Pool that didn't actually allow non-white people during their regular swimming hours during the week as late as 1955, I believe, as well. And that's all within the same like walking distance where Serafim would have lived. And so this to me just again shows how segregated that space likely was. And again, to just look around and look at yourself as a Black individual holding a gun, but also representing the maintenance of segregation and white supremacy on this beach is such a violent contradiction that I still can't quite fully comprehend.
Yeah, and of course, like the event that you relate in the book about the anti-Asian racism or actions that would have occurred here, obviously are part of a wider systemic, right? To add on to that term, moment that was happening in the West Coast of anti-Asian sentiment, right? More broadly, it's often called the quote unquote, yellow scare, right? Which is a terrible term, but that's what it was referred to as. And, it culminated even in, I think, 1907, 1908, in anti-Asian riots, right? So it is very difficult, I would imagine, for someone like Serafim to dissociate himself from this overarching sentiment. And you're right, it is very difficult to square that circle, so to speak. But yeah, I do think putting it in its overarching racial context does perhaps illuminate it, if not justify it, in some way. But yeah, thank you very much for that answer.
And I just want to add too,
Yeah,
just at
please.
the same time, it is potentially also what allows him to stay safe. And in
Yes.
Peter Hudson also speculates about this, because kind of a mascot, but in him being a mascot, he's also kept safe because of the amount of anti-Asian hatred that was prevalent in Vancouver at this time. And if you lean into kind of, I guess, that hatred, you're able to also keep yourself safe and essentially say, hey, look over there and I'll keep you all safe from that. But also it might have also been a move to keep himself safe and not the target of that same violence that still targets him, not as directly as was being seen at that time.
100%. Yeah. One of the last few questions that I have here is on the second half of your book title. So it's called The Life and Legacy of, Vancouver's First Lifeguard? Sorry, the legacy part is what I want to focus on here, is the gist of my question. And I'm wondering how exactly you do see the legacy of someone like Serafim. Do you see him in any way connecting to contemporary struggles that are faced by, other communities in Canada, or Afro-Canadian communities? Or do you see his narrative pushing back on, the Canadian inclusivity narrative in any way, shape, or form? I'm wondering, right, how you see his legacy play out in 2025 when we're having this discussion.
That's a big question.
It is. You can take a minute to think about it, or reframe it however you feel comfortable with.
Yeah, I mean, legacy is complex because in many ways, legacy is often not shaped by the living, right? Like, even if we put all of our efforts into representing ourselves, who we are, our work, and even if we are to even write, it can still get erased, forgotten, whitewashed, manipulated into something else by those who outlive us. And I think Seraphim, unfortunately, is a figure in Vancouver that for 100 years has been a little bit of what I think the city can point to in terms of diversity. And we love this Black man, and he was great. We treated him really well, and has conveniently erased a lot of what he essentially had to survive and he had to overcome to be able to, quote, like rise above, as we often hear, the circumstances that he was afforded. And I think it's really important that we point out that, the barriers that were put there didn't happen by an invisible hand. They were put there by the powers at be, the city of Vancouver, the province, Canada, all of these factors that affected his daily life. And I think it's important that we remember how segregation impacted and continues to impact the lives of non-white people in Canada, whether it be formally or informal segregation. Now, in terms of legacy, again, it's tricky again because he did not write anything that actually survived. There's a book that he alludes to that he was writing that for me is such a powerful, again, another portal into what he would have said and what he wanted to be said about him, that he strongly talks about. Like, I'm not actually sharing this with you, like as a reporter, he says on a couple occasions, I'm keeping it for my book, for my little book that he hopes to publish one day. And I think about that and why he might not have wanted to share parts of himself, maybe because he wasn't ready, but maybe also because he didn't want his identity and who he was to be shaped by anybody that wasn't himself. It's sad that we don't have that. And I think we can do our best to recover his identity by taking a look at Canada at the turn of the century, by taking a look at the ways in which racism has impacted the lives of non-white citizens and non-citizens in this country. And in that, we have to also look at ourselves when we look at legacy, and what parts of those kind of ugly histories are still alive sometimes in our actions and in our society today.
Yeah. And would it be fair on some level, I guess as an extension of this question, to call this a decolonial book, or a book that aims at some kind of decolonial project or praxis, or is that maybe taking it a little bit too far? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually,
Yeah.
it was one of the names that I was kind of toying with as
Okay.
kind of like a title for this book as well. But that's definitely
Wonderful. I always keep one last question for all the guests that I have on the show, and that is the classic journalist question. Is there anything that I did not ask in this interview? And what is the answer to that question?
I guess maybe the question is, what can we do now with the information that we've learned
Mhm.
about Seraphim's life?
Good.
And the answer to that question would be to take action in every single aspect of your life right now to combat every single form of racism and fascism in our lives. And I say that as Afro Latina writer, as a Black writer, thinking about my book that just came out last month, my first book, thinking about already how many places my book will probably not be allowed in the United States, might not be allowed in Canada, and how people like me who raise these topics and these issues are often the first ones to get censored and silent. And in order to not repeat these histories, that Seraphim survived, we have to take action, and it has to be also with all of us across identity, across borders. It has to be all of us that take action immediately to stop this, because it is on our doorstep. It is on our doorstep, and it has to be challenged, because otherwise people like me cease to exist.
I think that's an amazing note to end on. And I once again cannot thank you enough for being here today to talk about your new book, Searching for Seraphim, which, if I remember correctly, is published by Arsenal Pulp Press. Am I correct? Yes,
Yes.
wonderful. So I do encourage listeners to actually check it out. Do you want to share with listeners anywhere where people might find more of your work or contact you if they have any questions or inquiries? Anything at all?
Sure, yeah, you can find me on Instagram. It's at Tierra Negra Arts. And you can also look me up on my website, tierranegraarts.ca. I also run a body positive fitness, which I actually devote the majority of my time to. It's called Autonomy Fitness. And you can find more about that at autonomyfitness.ca or Autonomy Fitness.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.